The final infectious disease that we are going to be looking at for this chapter is called tuberculosis, also referred to as TB. And TB is caused by two types of bacteria, which fall under the group of prokaryotes. Remember, bacteria, just a bit of quick revision. Bacteria are organisms that have 70S ribosomes. They have circular DNA, and they also have a peptidoglycan cell wall. This is a revision in chapter 1. The thing about TB is two types of pathogens may cause tuberculosis. And the two pathogens are as follows: Mycobacterium tuberculosis or Mycobacterium bovis. If a question asks you in the exam, like name the pathogen that causes TB, if they just ask you for one, either one is fine. Okay. However, what we have to understand is, how does TB spread? Because the way TB spreads through Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium bovis are quite different. So, for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, what happens is the bacteria are inside our lungs, because it can affect many different parts of the body, TB, but the most common organ that is affected by TB are our lungs. So the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria are in the lungs, and when we cough or when we speak or when we even just exhale, we release out airborne droplets containing M. tuberculosis. And these droplets are then inhaled by the uninfected person. So if a question asks you in the exam, how does M. tuberculosis spread? You have to be a bit specific. You have to say the release of airborne droplets containing the pathogen or M. tuberculosis, which are inhaled by another person. However, for M. bovis, it's quite different, because it starts from cattle or cows in the farm, and the bacteria are actually in the cow. And what happens here is we ingest milk or meat that contains the M. bovis pathogen. And that's how TB spreads, via Mycobacterium bovis. So these are the two different ways in which tuberculosis can spread. For M. tuberculosis, it's through airborne droplets, and for M. bovis, it's from the infected cattle. So you have to know the distinction between these two. Now, the symptoms of TB, as I've mentioned earlier, most cases of tuberculosis affect the lung. There are cases of TB where it can affect your liver or even your bones, your spine for that matter, but we are going to focus more on the lungs. When it affects the lungs, it causes the lungs to start having these things known as tubercles. You don't have to memorize this. Tubercles are just they just look like these circular nodules that start appearing in our lung tissues, because this is due to the growth and damage from the bacteria. And because it affects the lungs, the symptoms are usually also lung related or chest related. Sometimes the person may have shortness of breath, they may have chest pain, chronic long-term coughs, and other symptoms may include fever and, quite commonly, weight loss. In fact, in the 1700s, TB was referred to as a disease known as consumption, because this disease seemed to consume you from the inside. Like the person would be of a healthy body weight, but due to TB, as the disease ravaged their bodies, they had this very severe weight loss that happened. And that is why it was known as consumption. These days, we don't call it consumption. We know that it's known as tuberculosis. Just a bit of extra information for that. Personally, I would try to memorize at least two symptoms. At least go with the weight loss and also shortness of breath or difficulty breathing. That's good enough for the exam. Now, a very important thing I would like to tell you here is there is also something known as latent TB. And latent TB just means that the pathogen is dormant or inactive. In fact, we estimate that 30% of the human population actually have latent TB. So 1 in 3 of us approximately will be walking around with these Mycobacterium pathogens in our body. But the good news is the Mycobacterium, the pathogens are inactive. They are not damaging your body, right? Because think about it, TB can actually spread very easily through airborne. So it makes sense that it can spread from one person to another quite easily. But just because the bacteria are in your body, it doesn't mean that you have TB. It's different from HIV because if you remember in my previous video, I did say that if a person has latent HIV, they may still be able to spread the disease. But latent TB is a little bit different because the pathogen is dormant or inactive, and the good news is it's not causing damage in your body. That's one. And the other good news is you will not be able to spread it to other people. So that's fine. But then comes the question, when does the latent TB suddenly become active and, cause you to have symptoms and start damaging your body, right? That usually starts to happen when the person is quite malnourished, when they don't have enough nutrients. They might have diabetes, smoking, which causes damage to the lungs. And the most important thing is latent TB can become active if a person has a weakened immune system, which happens due to HIV. In fact, if you remember in the previous video on HIV, I did say that when your immune system becomes extremely weak, it will cause a rise in opportunistic infections. And one of that opportunistic infection was tuberculosis. So you see the link here? So in Malaysia, usually, what doctors do is if you are diagnosed with TB, most of the times doctors will also do a HIV test just to make sure that your immune system is still fine because it's associated with each other. So then comes the question, okay, if the person has TB, how do we treat it? The main treatment for tuberculosis is antibiotics. Antibiotics are drugs or medicines that are able to kill bacteria or inhibit bacterial growth. Do not worry about antibiotics in detail because we will be talking about it in the next video. The thing about TB is just because you have antibiotics doesn't mean it's easy to treat TB. The reason is because multiple different antibiotics are given daily to the patient with active tuberculosis. The antibiotics may include pyrazinamide, ethambutol, rifampicin, isoniazid, and streptomycin. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Shit, do I need to memorize this? No, you don't have to memorize it. But what you do need to know is multiple different antibiotics are given to the patients daily. In fact, in some cases, the patients may need to eat a total of 10 to 15 tablets per day because some of those medications have to be taken twice or 3 times a day. So it repeats itself. So then comes the question, why do we have to give so many antibiotics at the same time? The reason is because some of the Mycobacterium might be drug resistant or antibiotic resistant. What that means is, so let's say the person's lungs over here is filled with the Mycobacterium, and let's say the doctor just gives pyrazinamide. Now, when pyrazinamide or one type of antibiotic is given, it may kill some of the bacteria, but notice that some other bacteria survived because those bacteria are unaffected by pyrazinamide, so they are antibiotic resistant or pyrazinamide resistant. So the doctor gives a combination of maybe 3 to 4 different types of antibiotics simultaneously. In this way, we increase the chances of killing the bacteria. So the bacteria may be resistant to one type of antibiotic, but it's not resistant to another type of antibiotic. That's how that works. And another very important thing that we have to know is the antibiotics are given through something known as DOTS. You might be thinking, oh, DOTS, what exactly is DOTS? Is DOTS something like, like polka dots? No, it's not. DOTS essentially means direct observation treatment, short course. You don't have to memorize the meaning, the long term, you just have to know DOTS. What that just means is the healthcare worker or the family member, a responsible family member, ensures that the patient takes their medication as prescribed. Because think about it, if you expect a patient to eat 4 or 5 different types of antibiotics daily, one of the common problems is patients may miss or forget to take their antibiotics. And we don't want that to happen, because if the patients miss the antibiotics or the patients forget to take their antibiotics, it may give bacteria chance to mutate and become resistant to different types of antibiotics. So we don't want that to happen. So in hospitals, when patients with TB are given antibiotics, the nurse or the doctor has to stand in front of the patient and make sure that the patient eats it and swallows it. So in the exam, if a question asks you what are the treatments of TB, you have to say multiple different antibiotics are given daily. And the reason is because it's to increase chances of killing the bacteria. And also the antibiotic are given through dots. A very important thing to also remember and just understand here is the antibiotics are not given, because some of my students may ask this question: how long do the patients have to take the antibiotics? The antibiotics, usually for TB, it has to be taken for 6 to 9 months. When you think about it, 6 to 9 months is a long period of time for the patients to be taking different types of antibiotics. That is why DOTS is important, and we have to involve responsible family members and healthcare workers to ensure that the patient takes their medication. And of course, we have to then explain how do we prevent the spread of tuberculosis. So the first way in which tuberculosis can spread through the M.tuberculosis pathogen is the release of airborne droplets containing the pathogen, and it's inhaled by another person. If you do not want these pathogens to spread via the airborne droplets, then logically what you need to do is you need to quarantine the infected person. Quarantine means that you separate the infected person from the uninfected person when they are at their most infectious. Okay, so people with tuberculosis, they are most infectious during the first 2 to 4 weeks. So during that first 2 to 4 weeks, the people with active TB should be quarantined, especially if they're showing a lot of symptoms. And they should be kept separate from their family members or even the general public. And they must also receive treatment during that time. The second way is by contact tracing, which is identifying close contacts. For example, let's say one person has TB, and the clinics or the hospitals will assess, oh, who's their child, who's their partner, who's their best friend who comes to visit them. Perhaps these people might have active TB too, and they spread it to that person. So by identifying one sick person, we can also identify the other people in the community who may also have active TB. The third one that we just have to talk about are vaccines. I am not going to go into the detail of vaccines because we will be elaborating on that in chapter 11. All we have to know about vaccines right now is there is a particular vaccine known as BCG. You don't have to memorize the name of the vaccine, but it's just good. It is just good to know that there is a vaccine involved in the prevention of the spread of TB. However, it is just a 60 to 70% protection. Now, another way in which TB can also spread is through the M.bovis pathogen, and it's by the infected cattle, and we ingest meat and milk that contains the M.bovis pathogen. So one way in preventing the spread of M.bovis is by identifying the cattle that contains tuberculosis and kill off the cow or the cattle so that it cannot spread it. Another method is also called the pasteurization of milk. Don't have to memorize the process of pasteurization, but what you just do to the milk is you heat the milk up and rapidly or quickly cool it down. What this does is, if the milk contains the pathogen, it will be killed due to the high temperature. So even if you were to ingest the milk, it is safe. And this process is known as pasteurization. There are also other ways of preventing the spread of TB. Remember, I mentioned before that about 30% of the population may have latent TB. So how do we prevent latent TB from becoming active? Remember, latent TB becomes active when the person is malnourished, they don't have enough nutrients, they may have diabetes, smoking, or a weakened immune system. So to prevent a latent TB from becoming active, we must improve the nutrition of the person or the population. So if the country has a lot of malnourished people, our doctors, nurses, and nutritionists will have to work in a rather large scale to improve the general nutritional standard for the country or the public. And of course, that's easier said than done, right? But we have to give it a shot. The second thing we have to do is improve housing conditions. And you see, sometimes due to poverty or due to substandard housing, many people can live in one house, like, 15 people in a small house. And I've seen this happen before, by the way, in certain communities. This is bad because when you have so many people in one house, number one, there is a tendency, I'm not saying not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, the hygiene standards of the house or the cleanliness of the house can be quite poor. And also the nutritional standards will be quite low as well. And because they are all in one tightly confined space, it is easy for TB to spread from one person to another. So housing conditions have to be improved upon. We can have, for example, 3 people living comfortably in a home. But in this case, to improve housing conditions, well, number one, houses have to be built. Proper houses have to be built. And number 2, housing has to be affordable for people, which is, well, if you're in Malaysia, especially in Kuala Lumpur, it's getting worse. If I wanted a decent home, all I'll get is a shoebox, and that's not comfortable for me. But again, that's just, my that's just a problem that I'm facing on a personal level. But moving on, and of course, if people have HIV, we do not want their HIV to lead to AIDS, because remember, if their immune system becomes too weak, it may develop AIDS, correct? So it is imperative to start them on ART medications to prevent the weakening of the immune system. So if people have HIV and you also put them on the ART, which is the medication that suppresses the HIV pathogen, their immune system will be protected, and they will also have lesser chances of getting TB and spreading TB in the population. Of course, then comes the question, why is it difficult to eradicate TB? All right, so this is what we know about TB right now. It is, for the most part, the common TB at least, is spread through M.tuberculosis in the airborne droplets. Latent TB is where the pathogen is dormant or inactive, where about 30% of the population have it. And people who are malnourished, diabetes, smokers, and also people with weakened immune system have a higher chance of getting active TB. This is what we understand about the disease so far. The first problem that we have in eradicating TB is the fact that it spreads easily through the air. So any other person can inhale the pathogen and carry it in their body. And just because they are not infected doesn't mean they do not have the pathogen in their body, right? And many parts of the world still have malnourished and poor populations. And because they are malnourished, if they have latent TB, it might become active. So that's what causes a rise in active tuberculosis. And of course, there is also a rise in people with HIV in the population. And there are more people with weakened immune system. And because they have a weakened immune system, they may also develop tuberculosis as well. Number 4 is because of migrations of people. The fact that TB spreads easily through the air, and then marry that together with the fact that people are traveling from one part of the world to the other, you will have a recipe for the easy spread of TB. So increase in migration can happen due to work, travel, and of course war that is currently happening in the world right now, Ukraine, Russia, Palestine, Israel. So these, among other wars, by the way, so these kinds of situations will cause mass migrations of people. And during mass migrations of people, usually it is coupled with people with having, because imagine they are they are running away from a country that is war torn, and they may not have enough nutrients, so they might develop malnourishment, and they might also, if they have latent TB, they might suddenly develop active TB, and this may be an issue too. So help has to be given as soon as possible in those cases. And one huge problem when it comes to TB is the fact that the Mycobacterium, which are the pathogens that cause tuberculosis, they are evolving to become antibiotic resistant, which means to say you have two people with TB represented by the green dots in the lung. Those are the pathogens. Person A, when they are given antibiotics, it kills off the pathogen. But person B, however, when they are given the antibiotics, only some pathogens died off, and the other surviving pathogens are said to be antibiotic resistant. And because it is antibiotic resistant, person B may also spread the disease to other people as well. And this can be an issue. That is why, if you remember, when we were talking about antibiotics, I did say that doctors will usually give at least a combination of 2 to 4 different types of antibiotics to increase the chances of killing the bacteria. But this list explains to us why TB is not an easy disease to eradicate. I hope you understand this.